And religion is a perennial divider of humanity. It increases tribalism. It increases in-group, out-group thinking. It increases us versus them orientations.
Christianity helps spread democracy, helps sustain it, helps lower corruption. Secularism cannot produce progress that can last for generations if it's just slowly replaced by other cultures because of higher birth rates.
So I can't tell you how many Christians I've talked to who said we are worthless, we are disgusting sinners, and we need Jesus to save us. This doctrine of depravity. What a horrible basis for a civilization. The places where there's the less suffering, the least homeless, the least poverty is in societies that have moved beyond literal Christianity.
I'd say a post-Christian society is like a beautiful rose that's been plucked. You put it in a vase for a few days, but it's eventually going to die. But let's see what's going to happen in 3 or 4 or 5 generations. Let's wait till secular atheists are raised by secular atheists who had grandparents who were secular atheists. Let's see the society they produced.
Hello and welcome to the debate, Christianity or Secularism, which is better for humanity? To debate this topic, I'm joined by Phil Zuckerman and Michael Jones. Phil is a professor of sociology and secular studies, and he's also the author of several books, including Society Without God, Living the Secular Life, and What It Means to Be Moral. Phil will be arguing in favor of secularism. Michael, on the other hand, is a Christian apologetic who has a master in philosophy from the University of Arizona. Moreover, he also runs the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy with over 400,000 subscribers. And Michael will be arguing in favor of Christianity. And we will start off with you, Michael, for your opening statement. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to discuss this with Professor Zuckerman. Something I've been looking forward to for a long time, even before the offer was made. So I'm really happy to be here. Although there's a lot we disagree on, I have a lot of respect for Professor Zuckerman. I hope we have a good conversation, and I enjoy reading some of his books, even though, again, there's a lot we disagree on. So, which is better for humanity, secularism or Christianity? I'll go through these slides here. I will argue the data shows the answer is clearly Christianity. However, I first want to point out I'll not be arguing that if we all became atheists, that society would collapse tomorrow, or that we would experience immediate moral decay. I will only be arguing that Christianity creates more optimal societies that can endure and generate progress. Again, the debate is about which is better for humanity. Demonstrating that Christianity is better does not mean other types of societies cannot flourish or endure. I would just argue they do so in a less optimal way. Now, by Christian societies, I mean societies that are based on Christian values, and the majority of the population identifies as Christian, regardless of governmental laws. And by secular societies, I mean societies that are based on secular values, and the majority of the people identify as secular atheists. And I want to be clear, I'm not arguing for theocracy or any type of government. This is about the nature of different societies, not governments. We can talk about this later, but experts like Edward Grant, Tom Holland, Alan Ryan note Christianity led to the idea of the separation of church and state. So Christian societies do not necessarily result in some form of theocracy. In fact, I will bring up research that shows Christianity is positively associated with democracy and less authoritarianism. And one more thing, I want to acknowledge Professor Zuckerman is not one to argue religion has no benefits, but he's also argued secularism is a better system for humanity. One reason he's given in interviews is because most religious individuals are good because of obedience, whereas secular people are mainly motivated by compassion and empathy. But this is an oversimplification. Secularists can be motivated by obedience as well, such as obedience to the state, peers, workplace superiors, parents, or other guardians. It is not the case that secularists are necessarily mainly motivated by virtues, and that religious people only have obedience as their main motivation. Second, it should be clear that religious individuals can also be motivated by empathy and compassion. Paul said in Ephesians, "For by grace you have been saved, through faith. This is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one can boast." In other words, Christians do not have to do good works for fear of punishment or to earn salvation. It is a gift of God, and we are called to do good, simply because it is the right thing to do. We love because Christ first loved us. We don't have to love because Christ will punish us if we don't. Third, if religious morality was only about obedience, we would not have missionary activity. Not all Christians are called to be missionaries or dedicate their lives to charity. One can live an ethical life without becoming a great saint or ever doing charity work. But Christian missionaries have been crucial for building a better world. Numerous studies, which I have on slide 7, show this, and have shown that Christians and their religious motives have helped create this. They've led to things like higher literacy rates, more education, better hygiene habits, medical care, economic progress, freedom, etc., etc. And this was not only accomplished in historical white regions, but in places around the world. None of this was required in order to be obedient to God's law. Christians went out of their ways to do these things because of their empathy and compassion. In fact, from all these studies, it is hard to deny that Christians have not made the world a much better place in ways that secular humanists have not. Now, one may say that secular humanist cultures are relatively new and so haven't had enough time to generate the same amount of positive change. That could be true, but research pushes back on this. Numerous studies show that religiosity is associated with more charitable giving to religious and secular organizations. On slide 11, a systematic review says, our systematic literature review, covering 77 studies, reveals that religion, measured as group affiliation, values, beliefs, and the importance of faith to the believer, as well as religious service attendance and private prayer, most often positively relates with giving to outgroup and secular organizations. Another study on slide 12 looked at 53 total nations and found that frequent churchgoers are more active in volunteer work and that a devout national context has an additional positive effect. So when a nation is religiously Christian, volunteer work is increased across the board. Religious citizens also volunteer more for secular organizations. But when a nation secularizes, religious individuals still volunteer at high rates, but secular individuals tend to volunteer less. They even say if secularization is an ongoing process in rich post-industrial societies, we expect declining levels of volunteering due to composition and context effects. Now, to be clear, secularists do give money to charities and volunteer time, but not at the level Christians do. Christianity has been one of the greatest institutions for wealth transfer from the rich to the poor in the history of humanity, and this is often accomplished through charity work. And as noted, numerous studies show that Christianity has made the world a much better place through missionary work. As the social scientist Arthur Brooks says, the difference in charity between secular and religious people are dramatic. Religious people are 25% points more likely than secularists to donate money, and 23 points more likely to volunteer time. And consistent with the findings of other writers, these data show that practicing a religion is more important than the actual religion itself in predicting charitable behavior. Now, you may think that Christians are only doing this out of obedience to God, but at least we're doing more. One may say secularists have better motives, but the fact remains what is actually happening in reality. Christians tend to do more charity work. So the data indicate that Christianity leads to more charity work inside a nation and outside its borders, and this has led to more economic progress, medical care, freedom, democracy, literacy, etc. If a nation secularized, this will likely decrease, which I think we can all agree is not a good thing. On this issue, Christian societies clearly outperform secular societies. As one famous sociologist, Phil Zuckerman, said in his book, religiously involved individuals also exhibit greater manifestations of prosociality than do those who are not religiously involved. Several studies have found that religious people tend to be more charitable, more generous, and more likely to volunteer and donate blood than their secular peers are. Furthermore, a proliferation of religious devotion, faith in God, and reliance on the Bible has historically been a determining factor in establishing schools for children, creating universities, building hospitals for the sick, and homes for the homeless, taking care of orphans and the elderly, resisting oppression, establishing law and order, and developing democracy. Christianity clearly generates far more prosociality than does secularism. The next issue I want to focus on is the rise of nationalism and right-wing authoritarianism. With the recent rise of Christian nationalism, many people are worried about the effects of Christianity. But they might be surprised to find out that research has found that Christian nationalism seems to be more motivating among the least churched individuals on the right. A study from 2021 found that among politically right individuals, Christian nationalism was found among the least religious or churched. To quote, "We find no evidence that Christian nationalism mobilized church-based support in the election. This is demonstrated by the fact that in our results, Christian nationalism is only strongly associated with Trump support for voters who do not attend religious services. Among religious attenders, the effect of Christian nationalism on Trump voting is not only weak, it is also not statistically different from zero. White nationalist groups in the United States explicitly use Christian nationalist rhetoric, but those who identify with such movements tend not to be strongly involved in mainstream Christian congregations." Similar results were found in Europe, for example. One study found that although populist radical right parties tend to advertise themselves as defending Christian identity and values, they don't attract many religious voters. PRR parties tend take pains to show that they are defenders of Christian identity and values, and yet they do not widely attract religious Christian voters. Our analysis confirms this paradox. As religiosity increases, the odds of voting for a populist radical right party instead of a mainstream right party decline. On slide 20, I have additional research, which found that anti-religious sentiment has been found to be more distressing to individuals who do not attend a regular church service. Unchurched Christian nationalists are more likely to favor an authoritarian figure using populist appeals. In fact, Christian religiosity tends to aid in making one less likely to vote for a far-right radical party. One may ask why this is the case, but the logic actually isn't complicated. When individuals on the right leave traditional Christian religiosity behind, they tend to keep a lot of the symbols and cultural heritage and then reinterpret them in political ways, therefore creating political religions that have repurposed Christian symbols. As Philip Gorski said, loose from its religious moorings, religious nationalism floats free of the ethical tether of Christian ethics and drifts even further in the direction of secular messianism and political authoritarianism. Roger Brubaker said, "It is precisely the ongoing erosion of Christianity as doctrine, organization, and ritual that makes it easy to invoke Christianity as a cultural and civilizational identity, characterized by punitively shared values that have little or nothing to do with religious belief and practice." On slide 23, we see similar results with attitudes towards immigration. One study looked at acceptance of refugees at the individual, regional, and national level. It found on the individual level that Christians, with the exception of Catholic Christians, and the unaffiliated are relatively similar in their policy preference regarding the admittance of refugees. Religious service attendance is associated with more generous policy preferences, but at national and regional levels, percent unaffiliated is associated with more restrictive preferences. 2017 study looked at anti-Muslim sentiment in Western Europe from before the European immigration issue and found that, although more secularized countries are on average more tolerant towards Muslims and Islam, the strongest anti-Muslim attitudes are nonetheless found among the non-religious in these countries. Additional studies have found that greater religiosity was linked to support for inclusive immigration policy. So it seems that traditional Christianity works as a suppressor of political religiosity. Without it, this will increase as secularization increases, and this leads to authoritarian ideologies and the erosion of freedom and civil liberties. This should not be surprising, because as on slide 26, we see that research has found that Christianity is associated with citizen empowerment, voice and accountability, democratic values, human rights, etc., lower levels of corruption, these kinds of things. Humans tend to be naturally religious, even though a small minority can refrain from this. Removing Christianity means man's natural religious inclinations are harnessed elsewhere. In an increasingly secularizing world, they will be manifested into political religions, which often result in more authoritarianism, the erosion of rights, and other things. So keeping a society Christian seems to be better long term. Not only will we see more charity work, which results in multiple positive effects, but we'll also have more freedom and less political religions and authoritarianism. Finally, I want to look at a pretty damning issue for secularism. A secular culture could create high levels of well-being and satisfaction, but it would not be good for humanity if it could not sustain itself for multiple generations, because it would die out and possibly be replaced by less optimal cultures. So any given culture must be able to sustain itself as part of the case as to why it's good for humanity. Christian societies have historically been able to do this by producing replacement populations through sustainable birth rates, and later generations can carry on the culture, generate progress. But secularism appears to not be able to do this. The countries that have secularized the most, and who have the most people who have left traditional religion behind, have some of the lowest birth rates of any nation. In fact, as secularism has been exported around the world through the internet and media, all nations' birth rates have decreased. But secular nations are falling below replacement levels. Eric Kaufman notes that it's the conservatives and fundamentalists who are producing the most children because of religious tenets about being fruitful and multiplying. So he predicts in a few generations, the religious will take over and the secularists will be in the minority. Similarly, evolutionary biologist Michael Bloom argues religiosity has been selected for its evolutionary advantages because it results in more offspring. On slide 32, this study conducted a multivariable analysis looking at 58 countries and found that secularism, even in small amounts, is associated with population stagnation or even decline absent substantial immigration, whereas highly religious countries have higher fertility rates that promote population growth. Many of the modern secular nations have to rely on immigration to deal with their aging and declining populations. But that means importing people from other cultures that tend to be more religious, who will go on to have more children and over time increase in population and replace the declining secularists. And also, Kaufman notes if pious children simply assimilate into the secular mainstream, the radical effect of religious fertility quickly dissipates. So secularism doesn't seem to be something that could endure multiple generations. It has to rely on immigration from other cultures to keep its population level sustained. But this opens it up to being taken over by harmful cultures, like Salafi Islam, where rights and freedom will be removed, especially for women. Even if it is eventually replaced by a more optimal culture like Christianity, the point is still that secularism is unsustainable. It cannot produce long-lasting progress, well-being, if it slowly diminishes and is replaced by something else. Christianity, on the other hand, is able to produce sustainable cultures that endure and have historically led to a ton of human progress, thereby making the world a better place. Secularism cannot do this and therefore is not as good as Christianity has been. Now there are many other variables we could look at, but I don't have time to cover in this opening statement. But in terms of charity work, pro-sociality, generating progress, keeping authoritarianism at bay, Christianity clearly has much better aspects than secularism. Secular societies also do not provide replacement populations, and so cannot generate progress. They cannot endure. Because of all these factors, I would say Christianity is clearly better for humanity, and I will yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Michael, for that opening statement. Now it's you, Phil, and you will also have 15 minutes.
Woohoo! Thanks, Michael. Nice to see you. Most impressed by your prep work. Thanks for your kind words about me. Really made me feel good. I thought your opening statement was reasonable. I appreciated all the research you did. I appreciated all the studies you cited. So I appreciate you coming to this debate in good faith. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Nils. You covered a lot of ground, and I don't want to use my 15 minutes just trying to refute this and refute that and refute this and refute that. I don't think that would make anybody enjoy this debate. So I'll just use this 15 minutes as my opening statement, and then I guess we can go back through and pick apart some of the things you broached. And I thought you broached a lot of good stuff, and some was weaker, some was stronger, and we can get into that. It was interesting to me that what I didn't hear anything about blood sacrifice and how that saves us from everlasting torment in hell. I didn't hear anything about a virgin birth. So I'm not sure what your Christianity is. Is it just a bunch of people who claim to be Christian? Like, is it the Christianity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Is it the Christianity of Idi Amin? Is it the Christianity of Martin Luther King? Is it the Christianity of Pat Robertson and Sarah Palin and Mike Pence? Unclear to me. I'm going to argue that there's different kinds of Christianity, and I think some are very beneficial to society, and some do a lot of good. And then there are really horrible and problematic aspects to Christianity that cause a lot of destruction and suffering and inhibit the best in human potential. So I don't really, I would never paint Christianity with one brush. It depends on what kind of Christianity we're talking about. The same is true for secularity or secularism. There's all different versions. There's the horrible Stalinist version, and then there's the inspiring, versions of people like Du Bois and Nelson Mandela. So it all, or what kind of secularism? Is it the secularism of India? Is it the secularism of French laïcité? Is it the secularism of the Nordic region, which is also very Christian in culture? So that said, here we go. This is why I think secularism is better for humanity. And I'll just start by saying my hunch is that Michael would not like to live in a world that was predominantly Muslim or Islamic. My hunch is he would probably not want to live in a world that is predominantly Jewish or full of Jews or full of Hindus or full of Buddhists. I'm an atheist Jew. The minute you say that you want a society that is predominantly Christian, I get the heebie-jeebies. Sorry. It's not my thing, man. I'm not Christian, and I don't want to be dominated by Christian beliefs. There's some Christian values that I appreciate, and there's some Christian values that I abhor, and I don't want to be beholden to those. That's why secularism is better, because we live in 2024, we are a diverse planet. We are not all one religion. And religion is a perennial divider of humanity. It increases tribalism. It increases in-group, out-group thinking. It increases us versus them orientations. And it has been a source of suffering for a long time. And yes, you can point to good things Christianity has done. You can also look at the history of Europe, which was a history of bloody warfare, century after century after century. Protestants and Catholics killing each other, both Protestants and Catholics killing minority sects and heretics, both Protestants and Catholics killing Jews. Like, it's been bloody. And that's why the framers of the US Constitution said in the first sentence of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Brilliant, brilliant. So secularism is not about denying people their ability to be religious. You can still be Christian in a secular world. You just can't dominate everybody else with your Christianity. Separation of church and state. It serves a diverse planet. We are a diverse people. We are multiple faiths. We are many faiths. Hell, I went to a Buddhist monastery this Sunday with my wife and chanted. That's the dream. Many religions allowed to flourish, but no one single religion is the dominant religion that controls everybody else's lives. Number 2, evidence-based decision-making. We're on a planet. I don't know why we're here. I don't know how we got here, but I know that we have to address hunger, homelessness, crime, racism, sexism, homophobia, hatred, the climate crisis. The climate crisis will not be solved by prayers to a magical being. You may think it's true, it's not. There's no evidence that prayers to a magical invisible being have ever helped humanity, other than the personal comfort it might give the person as their mom is dying of cancer or as their train is headed towards Auschwitz. Prayers certainly can help people calm and soothe themselves, but they don't make for change in society. Evidence-based reasoning is all we have to solve illness, to improve communication, to fight the climate crisis, to advance human rights, and to alleviate suffering. Scientific authority over biblical authority. I'm not saying science has all the answers. I'm not saying scientists haven't done horrible things in the past, but we can only show that science was wrong through better science. We can only show that science did horrible things in the past through the scientific method to disprove the false claims of past scientists. The scientific method cannot explain why we're here, the mysteries of the human heart, why it's not okay to eat my dog, or it is okay to eat my dog, and depending on the circumstances. But it's the only way, the best way we have to make decisions about how to alleviate suffering. Evidence, reason, science. These need to be the predominant values, and they are not the predominant values of Christianity or any religious faith. Next, democracy. You won't find it in the Old Testament. You won't find it in the New Testament. You won't find it in the Quran. You won't find it in the Upanishads. You won't find it in the Adi Granth Sahib. You won't find it in the Torah, the Talmud. Democracy is a human invention. It is not perfect, as Churchill said, but it's the best of bad. It's the best we've got, and it's hand in hand with secularism. Secularism is about accepting some existential mystery. We will never know the ultimate, we may never know the ultimate deep questions, why are we here, how ought we to live? And religion often gets hung up on those deep existential questions at the expense of the immediate concerns in the here and now. Charlotte Perkins Gilman made this point very strongly. She said that Christianity, Islam, these are death-obsessed religions that the ultimate primary concern is what's going to happen to you after you die. Secularism is a this-worldly orientation where the ultimate concern is what can we do for the baby that was just born. And then we need to rely on ourselves. Only we can solve our problems. We are flawed, we are jealous, we are violent, we are petty, we are tribalistic. We have inherited all these traits through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and millions of years of evolution as a primate species, and yet we are the only possible source of solving the world's problems, because we also evolved the ability to have empathy, compassion, to care about others, to understand justice and to be abhorred when it's by injustice. We abhor violence, we abhor hatred, even though we sometimes succumb to it. That's the reality. We have capabilities for good and bad. Christianity teaches that we are intrinsically evil, that ultimately, we are evil, and we need a magical, and I guess like a magical invisible deity made himself into a human who then had himself killed through some preordained fantasy, prophecy, and because this God, who then was also human, came from a virgin vagina and then killed himself. That blood somehow allows us to get out of hell and go to heaven. It is all insane. There's no evidence for it. It's just the crazy imaginings of people thousands of years ago. That's no basis for solving our problems in the here and now. Christianity is obsessed with what happens after you die. Secularism is obsessed with how can we make the world a better place in the here and now. This is all there is, folks. There's no afterlife. There's no heaven. There's no hell. This is it. And that is a much more sober orientation. It's not the most comforting. Hell, if you're suffering right now, if you're in a poor society and it's a corrupt society and there's violence and there's terror, yeah, it's nicer to think you're going to go to heaven afterwards. I get that. And I would never go up to somebody who is in those circumstances and say, well, guess what? This is all there is. Ha ha ha. Make the best of it. But I have to step back as a rational person and say, those societies that have made the most advances in alleviating suffering did it not through faith in a self-sacrificing Messiah who is the offspring of a man whose rib made a woman. No. Those societies today that have alleviated the suffering the most did so through using their reason, evidence-based decision-making, the scientific method with all its flaws. And yes, religion can help. It can have many good benefits, singing songs and having life cycle rituals, increasing charitable works and charitable giving. You bet. So I don't see it as black and white. Which is why in secularism, you can still have your Christianity. You can still gather as Christians. You can still pray to your God and beg not to be sent to hell. And Muslims can worship, and Hindus can worship, and Jews can worship. And we have a diverse situation where, as the First Amendment says, there should be no prohibiting the free exercise of religion. But the notion that we should choose one particular religion as the basis for society, how horrible, how terrifying, how anti-democratic, how intolerant, and the results will not be pretty, as we've already seen. We've seen what happens when Christianity is the dominant, enforced situation. It's not, yeah, maybe it's good for some people. It's not as good as democracy. And so that's my main argument. I think secularism allows for Christians can believe what they want, worship how they want, raise their kids how they want. It's all good. Secularism allows that, and it allows their neighbors to be Mormon and their neighbors to be Hindu and their neighbors to be Buddhist. But the big decisions, like how are we going to alleviate suffering, that in a secular society, in a secular culture, is going to be done by rational inquiry, evidence-based decision-making, the scientific method when appropriate, not through prayers and supplications to some invisible magic deity who already knows what's going to happen anyway and is sort of watching his little creations, and whether he's making a list, he's making it twice, he's going to find out who's naughty and nice, like this cosmic Santa Claus. I just think that's a horrible basis for any society. If it comforts people, great. If it causes them to give more charity, great. Mormons are amazing at charity. Their religious beliefs are lacking any evidence. So I'm not going to become a Mormon just because their streets are safer than elsewhere, and because they give so much to charity and they help each other out. When someone's out of work, they are there giving them groceries, a place to live, paying their mortgage. I mean, that's no way to decide. I feel like that's a problem to sort of look at these outcomes and say, well, let's do that. It's like, Japan has the lowest violent crime rates in the world. Should we all become Shinto and Buddhist? Should we all speak Japanese? Like, these correlations and causations are very tricky. And at the end of the day, Christianity asks me to believe something without evidence. And that's a house of cards. It asks, and not just Christianity, most religions. Now, again, if you're talking the sort of watered down, humane Christianity of some of my Quaker friends, or, all right, you might have a stronger case, but I'm going by what I read in the Bible. And what I read in the Bible is evidenceless, baseless, often immoral, often corrupt, often dangerous and deranged. And to me, that's a very, very scary basis for a society. And when I lived in Scandinavia, which is a very Christian culture, nobody believed that stuff anymore. So, if anything, you could make the case that like a post-Christian society might be ideal, one that had Christianity in the past for a while, but has grown up and no longer believes that we're all sinners in need of salvation, and no longer believes that these ancient stories are actually true, but are rather just metaphors and allegories and containing some wisdom, but they're from human culture. So I guess I'll end there because now I can't even remember all the things that you had said in your opening statement that I wanted to either agree with. Oh, 1 minute. Well, what I can tell you is, I'll give up my 1 minute to charity.
Thank you for that.
What do we got now?
Thank you, Phil. Now we'll move on to the first rebuttal from you, Michael, and you will have 10 minutes this time.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate what you said. And I enjoy reading your books. I think you're a very good writer. A lot of times you read someone and they're hard to read or follow, but do a pretty good job. So to address a lot of what you said there, I want to start by restating my 3 points. Again, I want to say Christianity is just more optimal. So again, because we see more charity work, more pro-sociality, we see it holds back nationalism and authoritarianism in very important ways. And of course, it creates a sustainable population that can continue on and continue to grow. Secularism has very big issues with birth rates. You can't be good for humanity if you cannot last for more than a few generations. So that's a problem right there. You mentioned asking me what Christianity am I talking about? Well, I'm just talking about it generally. You could call it mere Christianity. You believe in Jesus, you believe in God, you believe that Jesus died for your sins. These are theological aspects that are irrelevant. It's just generally Christianity. Now, of course, you're right. There are different kinds of Christianity, but I mean, I think that's just irrelevant to the main point that we're getting at here, because there's different kinds of secularism, as you correctly stated. You mentioned I wouldn't want to live in a predominantly Muslim country. Absolutely, I wouldn't. I don't know about other religions like Sikh or, for example, Judaism. I think I'd be fine with those. Islam with the Sharia, I think, is problematic, though. But you talked about Christianity having problems for like enforcing Christian values on people. Well, again, research shows Christianity is created separation of church and state. So Tom Holland says in his book Dominion, the separation of church from state was an upheaval manifest across the whole of Christendom. He says this in his book Dominion on page 235. Alan Ryan, on his book On Augustine, states that Augustine starts to develop this idea, and then it starts to flourish in the Protestant Reformation. You should read Article 28 of the Augsburg Confession. I bet you would really like it. Daniel Treisman's paper, The Cause of Corruption, a Cross-National Study, notes that Protestantism plays a role in monitoring and denouncing state officials, is associated with lower corruption, and helps establish a pronounced distinction between church and state. In the book Culture Matters, they say on page 120, Protestantism reduces corruption in part because of its association with individualistic, non-familistic relations. So I don't think we'd have to worry about this in a Christian society. You can be secular in a Christian society. You can be Muslim. We have the separation of church and state. It comes out of the Christian history. It comes out of Christian heritage. You mentioned that Christianity increases tribalism. I'd like to see the research on that. If you want to talk about the 2010 meta-analysis on racism that you've cited a lot, I'd be more than happy to talk about that, because I got a lot of questions about how you use that. You mentioned increases violence. Well, I would argue against that. Davis's Brown study, The Influence of Religion on Interstate Armed Conflict, looked at Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. Islam was positively associated with more war and conflict. Buddhism was non-significant. Christianity was negatively associated with more interstate armed conflict. So it was even better than Buddhism in that regard. Also, check out William Cavanaugh's book, The Myth of Religious Violence. He just notes it's impossible to separate religious from political, economic aspects when it comes in this, and just to sort of blame religion on violence in the past is an oversimplification. You mentioned the climate crisis, and I agree that is an issue. But research shows, especially when it comes for right-leaning individuals, I would think you'd want them to be religious. So studies like political conservatism, religion, and the environmental consumption in the United States, in that study, they say we can assert that there is no evidence that in any of our measures that religiosity intensifies the negative political conservatism effect. We provide evidence that the Strongest negative conservatism effects are found among those who are the least religious. Another study, does religion promote pro-environmental behavior across cultural investigation? They said the results of this study show that religion induces pro-environmental behavior. Religion promotes individuals' willingness to contribute money and dampens individuals' protest against contributing for environmental protection. Similarly, religion has a positive effect on ecological donations and participation in the environmental demonstration. And they looked at over 200,000 individuals across 91 countries from between 1989 and 2014, and they had 120 regression specifications for that. So I think that's important. You mentioned that in secularism, scientific authority is over biblical authority. Well, you're in luck because, again, in Christian societies, it's very much responsible for the rise of modern science. I recommend Toby Huff's book here. Basically, what they argue, him and others like Edward Grant, note that because Christianity developed something known as the separation of church and state, it allowed for modern science to develop as its own institution. This is Edward Grant. You can check out his book, The Foundation of Modern Science. So I don't think you're going to get a problem here. In Christianity, we have this concept we talk about called the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. They're supposed to work with each other, and nature helps us interpret Scripture. Scripture helps us guide us as we go through nature. Even if you go back to the 1600s, Bellarmine, one of Galileo's opponents, said, if you turn out to be right, we will just have to reinterpret Scripture. They weren't willing to just say, nope, Scripture no matter what. Bellarmine said, I will reinterpret Scripture in the 1616 injunction. So that wasn't an issue there as well. And we can go more into that if you want to. And again, missionary activity has been shown in numerous studies to alleviate suffering. People were motivated by the idea of the Great Commission to go around and spread the gospel. So the studies I cited did a whole video last year called How Christianity Changed the World, and I go over these studies. And missionaries went around, and in order to spread the gospel, they had to teach people to read so they could read the Bible. So they spread literacy and education. They built hospitals, orphanage. They generated economic progress, and these studies have shown this. You can check out research like, for example, like Robert Woodbury or others who've put forward studies on this stuff. You mentioned that we've seen what happens when Christianity is the dominant belief in society. And I'd like you to expand on that because there's a lot more factors when it comes to the Middle Ages that we need to consider. So, for example, if you go back in time, Nathan Johnstone wrote a book called The New Atheism. And on page 224, he says this. Now, Nathan Johnstone, by the way, is an atheist. He's not religious. He talks about Christian societies in the last millennium. He says this: between the end of the Roman Empire and the late 12th century, torture had fallen into disuse in Europe. Sam Harris might be surprised to learn that Christendom owed its reintroduction not to bloodthirsty clerics, but to scientific jurists concerned to free justice from the reliance on God's intervention and to champion human judicial competence. In both medieval Europe and modern-day America, then, societies that had abandoned torture contemplated its reintroduction as a rational necessity. But the medieval story, the one for which we know the ending, recounts the failure of rationalism to control its offspring. So this idea, if you're going to say that, when Christianity was dominant, we had all these horrible effects, I would argue that's one variable among many. How do we know it wasn't other variables? Johnstone argues it was actually the reintroduction of rationalism in its early formations before it developed into more, I would say, civilized forms, had these horrible offsprings coming out of it. So we just can't go medieval Christianity, look how bad it was, therefore Christianity was the cause. There are other variables at play. You brought up Mormonism, and I just want to say, I'm not going to convert to Mormonism just because Mormons are really nice, but these are different questions. Something can be true and not beneficial, and something can be beneficial and not true. I'm not saying you should convert to Christianity because it's beneficial. I'm just arguing that Christianity produces more optimal societies. You said, you mentioned, wouldn't a post-Christian society be better? Well, I would respond to that with saying, well, no, because then again, as Eric Kaufman notes in his book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, you get declining birth rates. So you eventually just revert back to religious society. It's unsustainable is what I would say. And again, you're going to have decreased effects in a post-Christian society. I'd say a post-Christian society is like a beautiful rose that's been plucked. You can put it in a vase for a few days, but it's eventually going to die. When it comes to post-Christian societies, they could be great for now, but let's see what's going to happen in 3 or 4 or 5 generations. Let's wait till secular atheists are raised by secular atheists who had grandparents who were secular atheists. Let's see the society they produced. Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, notes Christianity was like a depth charge. It took a while to influence and take over and create Christian societies. It took hundreds of years, if not thousands. So I don't think we should just judge based on what post-Christian societies look like right now. So I think those are important aspects that need to be covered. And also with regards to this idea of empathy and ethics, and these are just human values. No, if you go back to the ancient world, they were very, very much built around the idea of honor and shame. They didn't have the idea of mercy and empathy and justice that we have. Tom Holland notes this comes out of Christian societies. Let's go to an ancient Near Eastern scholar, Karl Vandertorn, in his book Family, Religion, and Babylonia, says the Babylonians did not have an introspective tradition and had little sense of interiority. Subjectivity had not been invented yet. The virtual absence of interiority and subjectivity in the Babylonian autobiographical traditions follows from the concept of a person as a social role and character. Individual identity in this view is not what you are deep down, but what you manifest to be. It's public and social. And scholars like Jean Bottero, John Walton, thank you, Joshua Berman, note that Judeo-Christian values started to create this idea of internal guilt, interiority, integrity. Things were no longer right or wrong based on how honor and shame were defined in a culture, but on this idea of these internal is's and oughts. And so I think Christianity helped to guide humanity. And the research does show that. I could go over some ancient Near Eastern scholars on that if you want. But I'll yield the rest of my time with that. I think ultimately, though, when it comes to the data, Christianity just creates more optimal societies. I'm not saying secularism is doomsday, though. I think it just less optimal societies cannot be sustained and generate progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. It's so funny to me, like, we can't even really soundly read people's minds and hearts right now in the here and now. So I love how these academic scholars can tell us, what it meant to be human 5,000-10,000 years ago. I mean, this is classic historical bullshit. Like, no one's going to contest it. No one can read the minds of ancient Babylonians or the hearts or minds, and all they're doing is projecting their own narrative on there. And I just don't have any time for that. Like, guilt was invented by, come on. We don't even know how guilt works right in the here and now with all our advances, and someone's going to read the minds and hearts of people 10,000 years ago from a different culture. That's the kind of history that makes me want to throw up. All right, let me go through your points, Michael. Here we go. Christianity inspires more charitable works. That may be true. But I'll go back to your point. Doesn't make the basis of charity true. I think people that are involved in religion, that are involved in especially congregations, the data shows, but Christians who are not members of churches and do not congregate do not engage in charitable works in higher levels than others who are non-theists. So it's not the Christian beliefs that spur people to do these charitable works. And you can go to Putnam, you can go to American Grace. I mean, this has just been found over and over again. It's the embeddedness in a religious community where you are taught certain stories, you have opportunities, or you're constantly being asked to give. And I think that's great. And I agree with you that Americans, but it's a very American assertion, in the United States where we have a very horrible welfare state, where we all just accept that homeless people people with mental illness are just rotting in the streets and no one gives a fuck. Here in the United States, people that are involved in religious communities, Muslim communities, Christian communities, Jewish communities, Mormon communities, they give more in charity. I don't disagree with that. Doesn't make Christianity true. And what I would argue is all we need to do is look at where are homeless rates and poverty rates the lowest. Japan has no history of Christianity in its founding. Yes, there's always been 1 or 2% Japanese people who have converted to Christianity, but it is not foundational to that culture, and they seem to be doing a great job when it comes to low crime, low poverty, no homelessness, good health care, good elder care. Is Japan perfect? No, of course not. But when we look at country after country or state by state, if your theory was correct, then the most Christian enclaves in the United States should have the lowest poverty. Everybody should be giving to charity. But what do we find? African Americans are the most Christian ethnic or racial group in this country, and they have the most problems. It's not because of their Christianity. Shit, their Christianity is probably the only thing they've got left to clutch to. But we can address homelessness, secular approaches to alleviating suffering simply do better. Look at the UN Human Development Index. I just don't even know what to say. Like, yes, do individual Christians on average donate more to charity in the United States? You bet. But secular approaches to alleviating human suffering are far more successful at the national level, at the institutional level. Things like Medicare, universal health care, subsidized elder care, subsidized, yeah, charities are fine. They don't do the job as well as structural, universal approaches. Next, you say that Christianity actually inhibits tribalism and nationality. I find that hard to believe. I mean, there are some great passages, there's neither Jew nor Greek, all are one in Christ. But the research I'm familiar with shows a strong correlation between increased religiosity and increased nationalism and increased tribalism. But I'm open to seeing your research, and maybe that's not the case. Still doesn't make Christianity true. Christianity makes more kids than secular people. It's interesting. I feel like you toggle between, oh, well, that's correlation, not causation, but when it suits your needs, you do the same thing. We know why people have less kids. It's called the high cost of living in highly industrialized worlds. To say it's a result of secular values is absurd. We know that the more religious people always have the most kids. That's in every religion. Orthodox Jews have more kids than less religious Jews. Deeply religious Christians have more kids than less religious Christians. Muslims, Mormons, you name it. So are you saying that the most extreme versions of all these religions are somehow better for the world because they produce more kids? Fertility rates does not tell us anything about the truth or faults of secular values or Christian values. All we know is that with industrialization, with a higher cost of living, children, which used to be an advantage. The more kids you had, the better your farm, the better likelihood your farm was going to succeed. Today, kids are a burden. They cost more, especially in societies where you have to pay for all this stuff. So the notion that it's Christianity that gives us high fertility and secularism that's going to end in the death of, of humanity, I think that's a bridge too far for me. And also, but you also selectively choose your examples. Like when I look at the largest, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but the largest body of Christianity is Catholicism. Catholicism has done many good things, built hospitals, universities, but they also oversee the largest pedophile ring in human history. So where's the fault here? You say that Christianity is more peaceful. I think sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. I guess it's just how we're reading history. Like the samples you cited, are they talking about in the last 50 years, the last 1,000 years? How is it being measured? I'd have to look and see. Now, this is where I'm going to say, I feel like you and I are reading history differently. You seem to think that anything that comes out of Christendom is because of Christianity. I would argue that most humans were Christian in the West for a long time, and then things developed within that context, not because of Christianity, but either for some other reason or in spite of Christianity. Let me explain what I mean. So, for thousands of years, Christianity was the dominant cultural, political, and religious framework. It was a sacred canopy, to use Peter Berger's version. It's all there was. Everybody just took for granted that there was the Christian way was the way. Within that, people made great architecture. Is that because of Christianity? Of course not. The architectural development occurred simultaneously within Christianity, but it's not because there's nothing in the Gospels which gets us to great architecture. That's like saying, hey, well, I don't want to get into metaphors and analogies. It just gets too. It's like saying, oh, algebra developed in the Islamic world, so Islam created algebra. Of course not. There's nothing in the Quran that produces algebra. It just so happens that the truths of algebra were discovered within a Muslim civilization. That's how it works, right? So when you say that the separation of church and state comes from Christianity, you're making a terrible mistake. And I don't know if your degree's in history or not, but what you're doing is you're saying, well, the separate ideas about the separation of church and state emerged in a society that was largely Christian, but not because of Christianity. Jesus never talks about the separation of church and state with possibly the exception of, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and render unto God's what is God. Yay, woohoo! But the real people who developed the separation of church and state did so against Christian orthodoxy, not because of Christian orthodoxy. And you talk about modern science coming from Christianity. Oh my goodness, this is again the same fallacy. Just because scientific reasoning, just because Mendel happened to be Christian and also looked at peas, that doesn't mean his scientific empiricism came from his Christianity. They just developed simultaneously. Just because Jesus did not explain anything about, hey, if you want to cure illness, there's bacteria. And even though we can't see it with our eyes, this is how you deal with bacteria, right? No, Jesus said, like, put mud in your fucking eyes and that'll make you see. Like, so I guess you're saying Christianity, and when I think of Christianity, I think of Jesus and the Gospels and the Scriptures. I don't think of just Christians who happen to discover scientific things. And so I would argue that to say that modern science comes out of Christianity is just, I think, flagrantly false. That's not to say that Christians weren't at the forefront of it, but they were Christians who happened to be interested in science and understanding science. It wasn't their Christianity that prodded them to suddenly understand the scientific method. The fact that you and I are communicating right now, I think Nils is in Denmark. Michael, I don't know where you are. None of that is because of Christianity. There's nothing in the Christian scriptures that tells us how to create simultaneous broadcasts and podcasts and videos. Everything we're doing right now was the result of empiricism, rational observation, the scientific method, and in terms of missionaries doing great things in the world, again, that's a subjective reading. Do I think missionaries did a lot of good? You bet. They also did a lot of harm. That's the nature of human activity. It's never black or white. And I think that a strong case could be made that it was the strong Christian defense of slavery that resulted in centuries of human suffering here in the United States. Christianity supports slavery. It does not denounce slavery. Paul supported slavery. It is embedded there, and the Christian slave owners used it to the hilt. And even though many Christians were anti-slavery, they had to become anti-slavery against Scripture, not because of Scripture. And I'll end right there.
Thank you, Phil. Michael, you have 5 minutes for your second rebuttal.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. I'm going to try to go fast to address all your points. So far, we've really not seen any evidence as to why secularism is more optimal. We've just seen attacks on Christian society. But I mean, that's not really showing us secularism is better. You opened by saying that the historians I cited, this is just classical historical bullshit. I think it's kind of weird just to diminish actual experts in their field when they talk about this stuff. This is basically the consensus among ancient Near Eastern scholars, and it's really weird to just dismiss actual experts.
All three of them. No one knew. I mean, they sit around at conferences
Can I finish?
Yeah, Phil, you will have your 5 minutes afterwards.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, Michael.
My bad.
And of course, I can cite more like Karen Ray Najat, as well as plenty others if you give me enough time to. But again, that's not really the point of the whole debate. You said that charity results from being embedded in the community. It's not from Christian religiosity. Well, not necessarily. There's lots of studies on intrinsic religiosity versus extrinsic religiosity. And we see intrinsic religiosity is associated with more pro-sociality, self-control, lower levels of depression, higher mental health. But even if that's not the case, Christianity still generates these communities. We've not seen secularism produce something at the same time that could produce the amount of charity work that we result from the communities that Christianity is producing. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. You could say that it's just the communities they're building, but secularism has not given us something to replace the community structures that Christianity is able to create. You argued that, a lot of these, you argued that the secular approaches are better at alleviating suffering. Sure, but that doesn't mean they're incompatible with Christianity. Again, a lot of what you would call secular approaches come out of Christian missionary activity, like building hospitals and alleviating suffering, creating orphanages, building schools. They're not incompatible with Christianity. So I find it weird that you brought that up. You mentioned secularism and birth rates, and you said, well, this might just be correlation, not causation. I will remind people of the study I cited, Secularism and Fertility Worldwide. They calculate this thing. They did a multivariate analysis, and they said secularism, even in small amounts, is associated with population stagnation, even decline. They say immigration could counteract population stagnation or decline in high secular societies, but it's important to term of demographic limitations and secularization. Immigrants tend to be more religious than native-born population in secular societies. So they calculated this stuff, and they're still finding a positive association there. So secularism does seem to lead to population stagnation and absolute decline. And I think you even talked about this a little bit in your book, Society Without God, that this is a problem in secular societies with these birth rates going on. You said the Catholic Church has the largest pedophile ring. I mean, I would refer you to a great article by Dr. Thomas Plant, who wrote for Psychology Today, separating facts about clergy and abuse from fiction. No, so more kids have been abused in public school systems than by clergy. So should we get rid of the public school system or say they're running a ring? No, let's look at the actual numbers and statistics here. And I would refer people to that article if they want to see the actual numbers that he runs. So let's not just, again, correlation, not causation. Are there any studies that show that Christianity leads to child sexual abuse? No. In fact, if you read John Martin's work, John Martin's it points out that early Christians invented new language to deal with the fact that the Greeks and Romans constantly sexually abused young boys and girls. They were on the forefront of ending that in the ancient world, and why it has been ended around the world. Again, we can see missionary activity doing similar things, and I cited that in my video, How Christianity Changed the World. Actual research that shows Christians went around and they saw other cultures abusing boys and girls, and they put a stop to it. Phil suspects that science didn't come from Christianity. I'm sorry, this is just a consensus of historians of science. It's not the only factor that gave rise to modern science, but it was crucial. This is like Noah J. Ephron, James Ungariano, Edward Grant, Toby Huff, who I mentioned, many others. This is just basically, as I said, the consensus of experts. And how? Well, ancient Greeks and Romans didn't have the idea that everything was governed by natural laws that were unbroken. Christianity gave us that idea, this idea there was a creator that governs the laws, and he is these laws are discoverable in the world, and we can learn about them and use them for advantage. You talk about the doctrine of total depravity, but Noah J. Ephron and James Ungariano note the doctrine of total depravity led to the scientific method, because humans are depraved and we can't trust our intuitions per se, so we have to keep doing constant experimentation to verify results. Read Noah J. Ephron's chapter in the book, Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths. He will tell you the doctrine of depravity led to and helped to develop the scientific method. Again, this isn't coming from me. This is coming from the actual experts. You mentioned missionaries going around doing good work. Well, again, I just refer people to the studies I cited. These have actually been the studies I cited ran certain models, and they found that missionary activity is associated with positive, beneficial change, even though missionaries aren't perfect. I could agree, but it still found that. So I'll stop there because I think I'm over time.
Thank you, Michael. Phil, you have 5 minutes. Michael. Go ahead.
I appreciate your fervor. I like the quote, humans are depraved. I think that would be a great banner for your Christian society. Humans are depraved. That is the heart of Christianity. We are sinners. I can't tell you how many Christians I've talked to who said we are worthless, we are horrible, we are disgusting sinners, and we need Jesus to save us. This doctrine of depravity. What a horrible basis for a civilization. What a horrible thing to teach our children. To me, the notion that we are all depraved is just cuts to the core of the depravity of Christianity as a worldview. So you ask me, Michael, all I've done is debunked Christianity and so on and so forth. So why is secularism optimal? Here we go. It's my contention that democracy comes out of the secular worldview, not a Christian or Muslim worldview. I could be wrong. It is my view that the separation of church and state is a secular value, not a Christian value. I could be wrong. I think evidence-based decision-making is better than faith-based decision-making. There's a reason that prayer would not allow us to have this conversation right now, but technology does. The nice thing about secularism is you don't have to believe in evidenceless claims from thousands of years ago. In a secular society, masturbation is natural and healthy, and it's okay. It's not a sin or it's not outlawed. Homosexuality is natural, okay. It's not outlawed. Now you're probably going to tell me that gay rights comes from Christianity too, but that's not the case. In secularism, women's rights is much stronger, not in Christianity, although you'll probably say that Christianity gave us women's rights as well. Animals are not just a means to an end in secularism. We consider animal suffering something to care about, but in Christianity, animals are just fuel for us, as the very story of Cain and Abel tells us. Even God likes dead animals as a sacrifice. In secularism, we have something called birth control. Catholicism does not allow it. Christians don't really like it, but they practice it anyway, despite their Christianity, not because of it. I would challenge anybody watching this to read the Declaration of Human Rights and compare it to the Ten Commandments. If you find the Ten Commandments a superior basis for society, great. The Declaration of Human Rights, which makes no pretense to any God, and it's purely, we know who wrote it. They sat around a table, human beings wrote the Declaration of Human Rights, and I would say that it's a far superior basis for a society than the Ten Commandments. Secularism is really strong on not hitting your children. The strongest laws against hitting your children come from secular governments. Christianity says you should hit your kids. It's a good way to raise them. And we know that child abuse is highly correlated with high religiosity. In secularism, we appeal to ourselves to solve problems, not a magical invisible deity who had to sacrifice himself in order to somehow save us. And this gets us back to depravity. The thing is that the notion, I would argue that most of the things we enjoy today, this conversation we couldn't have had when Christianity was in charge. Thomas Aikenhead was killed. All the early freethinkers were imprisoned. They had their tongues cut out. They were murdered. They were slaughtered by the Christian rulers of the day. So the very fact that we can debate religion is a result of secular values, not Christian values, not Jewish values, not Muslim values. If by that we mean the scripturally based religions. That's not to say there aren't individual Christians that love freedom of speech and debate. Of course there are. Just like there's some Muslims that are extremely open to debate and discussion. My point is that the human rights we enjoy, the freedoms why is the Bill of Rights so different from the Ten Commandments? Now, I'm going to argue is because humans developed, they matured ethically, intellectually, and the people that wrote the Bill of Rights were more advanced in their thinking about human progress than the ancient Christians. But Michael's going to tell us that, the Bill of Rights comes right out of Jesus's mouth. It doesn't. And it doesn't come from Paul's pen. And so I'm going to say the things we enjoy, like the welfare state, created the places where there's the less suffering, the least homeless, the least poverty, is in societies that have moved beyond literal Christianity, biblical Christianity. They've taken the good from Christianity, the ethics, spirits of inquiry, mercy, no question about that. They didn't reject those, but they developed those with more secular understandings of the world and more secular values. And I think that's the best, and I think that's what we enjoy to this day. And to return to a place where almost everybody's Christian, I guess maybe you'll let a few Jews, live in the alleys, and maybe a few Muslims can have some tree houses or whatever. But a society where most people are Christian, what a nightmare! Not where I want to live. And certainly, I certainly wouldn't have spent 2 years in Scandinavia if the people there all were walking around believing that the blood of Jesus saved them from everlasting torment in hell, and it was the Jews that killed their beloved Christ. I live in Scandinavia because the people there have moved beyond such fairy tales, and they've taken the best of Christianity and they've institutionalized it. So they have great health care, medical care, child care, elder care, and they don't want to see homeless people. Those are rooted in Christian values, but not Christian faith.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, that is it for the rebuttals. Now we will move on to the cross-examination. So you will have 10 minutes each.
Oh shit, I thought we were done.
Oh, no. We'll do 10 minutes each of questioning and cross-examining each other's viewpoints. That is, one of you asks questions and the other one provides answers. And we will start off with you, Michael, as the interrogator.
Phil, are you a naturalist?
You got to define that for me.
Do you believe that only the natural world exists?
No, I'm agnostic on that. There's things I can't fathom.
Okay. Do you believe that there is evidence of anything that's supernatural, though?
Not that I've seen yet.
Okay. So what would be the point of humanity, or the purpose of humanity on an evolutionary naturalistic account?
There is no one point. That's a subjective question. Meaning and point are purely subjective. I don't know what it is.
Well, why would species exist then? Like Richard Dawkins talks about this. Like, do you believe that the point of species is to propagate genes?
I don't know. Agnostic.
Okay. So you're agnostic on it. Okay. So if that's the case, if the point in our biology is to keep making more genes and spreading genes, wouldn't we want a system that has higher birth rates?
I don't know. I think quality might be better than quantity. If you told me, do I want a society where everybody lives freely and without suffering, but there's not that many of them, or a society with millions of people that are all eating each other, I'd probably take the former. So to me, there's quality and quantity that we have to take into account.
I agree, but don't you think that actual birth rates have to be important for sustaining that? I mean, I'm saying it's just a factor. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but don't you agree that has to be important for a civilization? They have to have sustainable birth rates to continue the human culture on.
Of course, if you don't have kids, then you die out.
Okay, so then if secularism in studies has been shown to correlate with lower birth rates, how can it be good for humanity long term?
Um, Whatever the solution to that problem is going to come through human thought, reflection, and decisions, not through appealing to magical fairies or gods. So if we see societies with declining birth rates, I think they're going to die out. And the society, and that may be how things work. I don't. I mean, that's certainly what happens with other species. If they don't reproduce, they die out. I think I read somewhere that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth no longer exist. So, um, if what you're saying to me is like, because secular societies have declining birth rates, we all need to, ask Jesus into our hearts, it's just a non sequitur to me. I don't see these things as like I can't believe in something that without evidence just because I see that secular societies have declining birth rates. Like, yeah, that's too bad. That sucks.
Okay, but again, the debate is not about if Christianity or secularism is true. It's about which is better for humanity. And given this, wouldn't this be a better aspect of Christianity because we can have sustainable birth rates, culture can continue on, we can generate progress versus secularism, where we have declining birth rates, and wouldn't that not be an issue?
I'm not, let me see if I understand your argument. Your argument is that highly secular societies have the lowest birth rates, and highly religious societies have the highest birth rates. Hence, the latter are better. Is that your argument? I'm trying to understand what your argument.
I'm saying I'm not saying higher birth rate is necessarily better. What I'm saying is you need at least a sustainable birth rate. And secular societies produce cultures that have below replacement levels. That's a problem for secularism because it cannot go on for multiple generations to produce progress. But Christian societies can do that.
Okay. I would accept that. Same with Mormon societies. Same with any society that has poor societies have higher birth rates than rich societies. So is poverty? The poorest nations on earth have the highest birth rates. The wealthiest nations on earth have the lowest birth rates. So are you advocating for poverty?
I'm saying you need at least a sustainable birth rate to ensure your culture goes on. If you don't have that, you can't get off the ground.
So if that sustainable birth rate is only in highly poor nations, would you say that's good for humanity?
I would say that variable, so we have to issue at variables, is necessary for a sustainable culture. But there are other variables in that culture which are bad. But you just can't say that variable is therefore tied to poverty and therefore it's bad. That's not how that works. I'm saying this specific variable is important.
Okay.
Let's move on. You mentioned that Christianity leads to more racism, and you've often cited this meta-analysis from 2010, why we don't practice what we preach. Where in this study does it show that religious people are more racist than secularists?
It doesn't, and I would never say that. I think there's different components to religion. There's belief, behavior, belonging, and all different aspects to religiosity. My understanding of that meta-analysis was the authors expected that in the area of belief, that strong theists would be less racist than atheists or agnostics. Their finding was, and it was a meta-analysis of over 50 studies, was that agnostics exhibited, white agnostics, the lowest levels of racism by whatever measures they were using, followed by atheists, followed by strong Christian theists. Do I think Christianity causes racism? Not at all. I mean, look at Martin Luther King. Look at Gandhi. He wasn't Christian, but he was certainly religious. All I'm saying.
Because I actually emailed the study authors because I was confused to where you were finding that. I got a reply back from David Matz. He said, I wouldn't say that our findings demonstrate that the non-religious are more racially tolerant than the religious, though I understand how someone could see that conclusion. We didn't compare religious people to non-religious people. Rather, we looked at people's level of religious identification and found that those who identify with less religion were generally more racially tolerant. Lower levels of religious identification don't necessarily mean non-religious. And this is from a private email dated the 10/15/21 that he gave me permission to share.
Sweet. Great. Okay, so I've seen many other studies that also correlate strong religiosity with higher levels of xenophobia, racism, but I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation. I don't think it's absolute. I think there are many exceptions. Yeah, so that's my response there.
Would you agree that meta-analysis are going to give us a better conclusion than individual studies, though?
I would think so.
All right, great. You mentioned that religious people are more likely to hit their kids. What studies have you used to show that? Do you have any studies that show this?
Yeah, I'd have to go get them, but they're on my
I
shelf. I just come unprepared for that.
That's fair. I will give you one you have cited. It's called Individual and County Level Religious Participation, Corporal Punishment, and Physical Abuse of Children, an Exploration Study. Do you remember that one?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'm
All right.
currently writing 2 books and editing 2 books. I don't keep these things filed in my bald brain.
Fair enough. I would just not sure that that's actually what that says, but we'll move on for the sake of time.
I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I love also the attention. It's so always interesting to me how religious people use their critical thinking skills so much when discussing, a political or social science issue, and yet when it comes to the historicity of their religion, all that critical thinking just sort of flies out the window. So I hope you'll use such critical thinking when you apply that to your Christian faith.
Great. Let's talk about Christian history then, using critical thinking. What is the evidence that Christianity leads to some of the things you were talking about from like medieval Europe or that? So let's talk about that, and we can use our critical thinking skills here.
Oh, I think if you have a religion that says slaves obey your masters, that's going to cause a lot of problems. The founder of Christianity makes that very clear.
Where does Jesus say that?
No, Paul. Jesus didn't found Christianity. Paul did. Jesus never said, "Here's a new religion. We're all going to be Christians now." Jesus was born a Jew, died a Jew. I think that when you have a father, the father of Jesus, or I guess he's Jesus, I don't know, it makes no sense to me, lists all the rules of how to treat your slaves in the Old Testament. Slavery isn't enshrined, except even in the Ten Commandments, it says, "Don't covet your neighbor's house, wife, slave, ox, or anything else." So to me, just that alone, the implicit and explicit acceptance of slavery as...
Let me ask you this. So the Romans put down a lot of slave rebellions, didn't they?
I don't know shit about Roman history.
Okay, well, they put out a lot of slave rebellions. What do you think would have happened if Paul wrote to mostly a Christian community that was mostly women, poor, and slaves? Hey, let's get rid of slavery. What do you think the Romans would have done in that culture to those people? They probably would have slaughtered them. What do you think about Paul?
I didn't know that early Christians were worried about getting... You mean Paul was like trying to be like save his ass or something?
I don't think he wanted his Christians to be slaughtered by the authorities. But what do you think about what Paul says in Ephesians 6, where he talks about slavery, and he says, he says this, but then he says in verse 9, "Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both your master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." So he says masters should treat slaves just like slaves treat their masters. Many researchers have noted, like Jennifer Clancy, for example, that this takes away the entire institution of slavery if everyone has to be treated equally.
So the difference between you and me is that I'm happy to treat these things as historical contingencies, but you consider those words holy, above reproach, somehow magical. I don't. I just think it's part of the human historical story, and I'm happy to say, oh, Paul said this, and Shakespeare said that, and I'm happy to take the truth or wisdom from any source, but I don't see them as coming from a magical, invisible deity. And I would just refer you to this book, and all your viewers, The Arrogance of Faith, which details, it's a big, thick historical book by Knopf, which details the degree to which slavery was justified directly by Christian scriptures. Well, that's my main source.
Okay, well, if you get to cite a book, I'd like to cite one as well, right here. For the actual historical development of why slavery was outlawed, I recommend Nobel laureate Robert William Fogel's book, Without Consent or Contract, where he points out that the Christians were crucial for ending slavery, arguing from Christian doctrine. In fact, he actually goes over the rational tradition in the late 1700s to note it failed to end slavery. It was the revitalization of Christianity and Christian ideas in the 1800s that led to the Civil War.
Why did Paul say slaves obey your masters if he was so anti-slavery?
Okay,
is that
go
the first
ahead,
question
Phil.
for me?
Yeah, let's start. Phil, you have 10 minutes now. Let's say that's your first question. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, let's see. What would I ask? Let's see. I guess, what does one have to believe at root to be Christian? Like, give me the bullet points.
All right, that there is one God. The God is so basically the Nicene Creed. So you believe that there is one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Jesus, born of a virgin, became human, died for our sins, rose from the dead on the 3 days, inspired Scripture, and he will return. Those are the essential Christian doctrines, I would say, that you need to be a Christian.
Can you be a Christian if you don't believe those things?
Well, depends on what you mean. Theologically, no. Sociologically, yes, because sociologists will include Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses often in groups and encompass like this big umbrella of like Christian tradition. So sociologically, I'd say yes, you could still be identified as a Christian. Theologically, I wouldn't be able to affirm that though.
So you can be a Christian sociologically, but also theologically, and these are distinct?
Well, because sociologists have to like group people a certain way. So Mormons are going to be more aligned with Christian culture than like say Ahmadis are. Ahmadis are going to be more aligned with Islamic culture, even though Muslims consider Ahmadis to be heretical. So they will group them in those things. So sociologically speaking, there's a big umbrella thing. We would say that is Christians, and it would be basically anyone that basically worships Jesus or follows him in the sociological sense.
So if someone came to you and said, I believe in alleviating suffering, I believe in treating others well, I believe in feeding people that are hungry, but I don't believe any of the assertions of the Nicene Creed, would you consider them a Christian?
No.
What if they said, I'm still a Christian even though I don't believe those things?
Well, luckily we have separation of church and state in Christian societies, and they can say what they want.
But what would you say they were Christian?
I could not affirm it, no, not in a theological sense. I could affirm it maybe sociologically speaking.
Right. So for you determine who is a Christian and who is not. Is that correct?
No, the Nicene Orthodoxy does.
Okay. So the Nicene Orthodoxy determines who's a Christian and who's not.
Yeah.
And when you say you want a Christian society, that means you want a society where everybody accepts the claims of the Nicene Creed?
In a sociological sense, a Christian society would be people identify as Christian and claim to follow Jesus and his teachings in a sociological sense. Now, that will include theological people that reject aspects of that. I can't say that. But again, in a sociological, this is why I'm trying to differentiate these things. Sociologically speaking, if someone is going to identify as a Christian, they follow Jesus, follow his teachings, believe he is king or God.
And so let's just take a real life example. So in Scandinavia, most people will say they're Christian if you ask them, but they don't believe those things that you just said. Are they, and I'm asking you, not sociologically, like, do you consider them Christian? They say they're Christian, but they don't believe in those bullet points you just made about Jesus being king or Christ or God or whatever. Are they Christian in your mind?
It seems to sound like they would be culturally Christian, based on the
I
ones
didn't
you're
ask if they're culturally Christian. Are they Christian in your mind?
Theologically, no. Culturally, yes, though.
And which are you advocating for, cultural Christianity or theological Christianity?
Well, this is a sociological debate, so I'm advocating for a sociological understanding in terms of the effects of the good that comes out of Christian society.
So in your view, a sort of cultural Christianity is really the best answer.
Yeah, but Christianity creates cultural Christianity.
Right, so it's a post-theological Christianity that you're advocating for.
No, because again, you just said these people identify as Christian, not post-Christian.
They identify as Christian, but they don't accept any of those theological bullet points that you presented, either in the Nicene version or the one you just reiterated about you have to sort of accept Jesus as your overlord or whatever.
Then how would they be post-Christian if they're still identifying as Christian?
Because their ancestors did. Their ancestors believed those things, but they don't anymore. So they see themselves as part of a Christian tradition. So which are you advocating for? Do you want society to sort of have Christian roots, and that's awesome, or do you want people to actively believe in those theological claims?
Okay, so theologically, yes, I want people to actively believe in those claims. In a society, though, we would want a Christian society where most people identify as Christian, as I said in my opening statement, believe that Jesus would be God or king or something of that nature, and that they allow his teachings to direct their life. And then we can have a debate with them about if they're theologically Christian or not, or how to best understand it. That's a theological debate. That's not a sociological debate, though.
So would you argue sociologically that we see the best societal outcomes of well-being, lowest crime rates, best health care, best elder care, best women's rights, best gay rights, best environmental policies, best animal rights, lowest levels of child abuse and assault, all these things tend to cluster in places where people are not strongly theologically Christian, but come from societies that have a Christian past. Would you agree with that? Or do you think it's the strongly Christian, like Zambia is very theologically Christian, Nigeria, very theologically Christian, El Salvador, extremely theologically Christian? I'm going to say to you, Michael, and I want to see your evidence here, the strongly believing Christian societies, the ones that adhere to your creeds, do not exhibit all the great social outcomes I just talked about. But the culturally Christian societies, the societies where people no longer hold those theological fairy tales, but they are the ancestors of that civilization, that's where you find the best societal outcomes. So if you want to be sociological, be honest and say, you're right, Phil, those societies that are less theologically Christian, but just have a Christian past, they're doing the best. If you're going to argue that you got to have that theology, then stand by El Salvador, stand by Nicaragua, stand by Senegal, stand by these highly Christian societies where people believe everything literally and they pray and they adhere, be honest sociologically then.
Is there a question? Because I'm confused what you're asking.
Are you advocating for a strong theologically Christian society or just people are sort of sociologically, like culturally Christian? Which do you think is better?
I think this is a false analogy because that's not the variable that they're using in these sociological studies. They're using just generally Christian societies. They're talking about Christian individual individuals.
I'm asking you, not them, you. When you list all the countries that adhere to a strong Christian theology and you compare them to all the countries that are culturally Christian but don't adhere to those, which is faring better?
Okay, first of all, I just want to point out this is a bivariate analysis. We're just looking at two variables, and we could easily fall into what I would call an ecological fallacy. This is why I went actual studies to do multivariate analysis to show these kind of things, because you just can't do that. For example, El Salvador and Honduras, they have other factors like geology, they have other factors like crime, they have other factors like that. Yeah,
I agree.
And
they all have
a lot
strong
of them,
Christian theology.
And if you read Rodney Stark's The Triumph of Faith, a lot of them are just culturally Christian. You're just assuming they're deeply religiously Christian.
No, I'm
and
not.
Stark points out that's not the case.
Michael, I think I've got you in a corner here. There's a reason that Nigerians line up to move to Scotland and not Scottish people lining up to move to Nigeria. Of course, there are other factors at play. Of course, there's economic, political. Right. But my point is that Scotland is one of the least theistic societies the world has ever known, but they used to be very theological, very theistic. Not anymore. Nigeria, all you have to do is ask people about their beliefs. Do they believe the Nicene Creed? Yeah. Just compare levels of Christian theology between Nigerians and Scottish, or between Nicaraguans and Danes. It's all there. You can deny it all you want. So?
You can easily suffer from an ecological fallacy or an association fallacy. You got to actually do a multivariate analysis. So then, why would we just look at that? Why don't we actually look at the studies that look at actual individuals and run tests, run something like a Stroop trial?
Because your claim is that theological Christianity has all these benefits and results. And I'm saying to you, you can't show that. And the fact, what I can show is, for whatever other reasons, dietary, linguistic, you name it, all of it, it's not theology. It's other things that have to do with this world, this life, this planet. And theology does not cause these great outcomes you're talking about. Other things do that are this worldly. And that's why secularism is the answer, not believing that Jesus is your master. It's not going to solve anything.
Then why have studies found extreme positive benefits with intrinsic religiosity and not just extrinsic religiosity? Like, for example, personal religious orientation and prejudice.
I thought you didn't like bivariate analysis. Now you use bivariate when you want.
These are meta-analyses. The religious orientation scale review and meta-analysis.
You just said external versus intrinsic versus extrinsic. That's a bivariate.
Yeah, and they are put into multivariate analyses. Like, for example, the religious orientation scale review and meta-analysis of social desirability effects. They took those factors along with other factors and compared them with various things like mental health, altruism, religious commitment, these kinds of things. So no, they weren't just comparing intrinsic.
extrinsic and extrinsic versus intrinsic religiosity is a bivariate. It's binary.
But they're not comparing. So, for example, the religious they're comparing intrinsic to other variables, and they're comparing extrinsic to these other variables. They're not just comparing.
I'm comparing highly theological Christian societies with less theological Christian societies, and then looking at a host of other things. Like you can't.
Then why do the studies contradict that?
They don't.
Yes, they do.
You're telling me that El Salvador has better societal outcomes than Norway?
No, I'm saying intrinsic religiosity leads to benefits. And the studies actually show that when you factor in all the variables in places like El Salvador.
You dismissed my analysis by saying, "Oh, it's bivariate," and then you proceeded to use bivariate analysis yourself. And I'm saying
no,
you can't
that's
have
not
it
what
both
I did.
ways.
No, pointing out there are different scale. There's different orientations, and when you look at them and compare them to like the 5 big personality traits, prosociality, self-control, you're comparing self-control. And then you're comparing these, but you're also going to factor in race, education, very geographical aspects as well. Mm-hmm. And then they factor them out to see if the intrinsic or extrinsic is still correlating with the positive benefit.
And you can do the same thing with highly theologically Christian societies and less theologically Christian societies. You can do the same thing, Michael.
And I would refer people to my opening statement.
That's it for the rebuttals. The cross-examinations. Now we will finish off with your closing remarks. And we will start with you, Phil. Take it away. You have 5 minutes for your closing remark.
Oh, wait. Didn't Michael get the opening?
Do you want me to go first? Because so Phil has the last word?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Michael, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Yeah, I don't want to. I think Phil should get the last word. I had the first word.
All right.
Okay. Let me start here. 1 second. All right. Well, I appreciate the conversation. I really enjoyed this. I just didn't see a lot of good evidence that secularism is more optimal than Christianity. Again, the 3 factors I opened with were more charity, more pro-sociality, a great protection against nationalism and authoritarianism, and of course, it's sustainable culture, so we can keep generating progress. If I told you I had 2 cancer treatments, one, let's say, could reduce cancer by 60% in 2 months. One could only reduce it by 50. But the first one stopped working after 2 months. You'd probably go with the other one, even though it's not as effective after the first 2 months, because it can keep going on. This is the problem with secularism and Christianity. Secularism cannot produce progress that can last for generations if it's just slowly replaced by other cultures because of higher birth rates. That's important to keep in mind. He mentioned at the end in this cross-examination that we can just look at highly theologically religious countries and say, well, they're doing far worse. Again, this is a bivariate analysis. That's not a good comparison. This is why we need to do actual studies, go into various places, look at sample sizes, and then factor out other variables: geography, poverty, education level, race, other aspects, gender, all these issues, and then see what religiosity is actually affecting. I cited research on this in my video, Is Christianity Harmful? And I pointed out that this religiosity is not causing these bad effects. What actually has happened is people in poor and impoverished regions just tend to become religious because they want hope, purpose, and meaning. People in more wealthy societies tend to abandon religion after many generations because they no longer think they need it. So this cycle, I would say this is a cycle that constantly continues throughout. Because again, we can see actually in the studies with robustness checks, multivariate analysis, that Christianity is positively associated with all these benefits. In your last rebuttal, you mentioned that democracy comes out of secularism, but I cited research in my opening statement that Christianity helps spread democracy, helps sustain it, helps lower corruption. So again, I'm going to go on what the actual science says here, not on what the opinions are. We need some actual research on this. Now, again, I'm not saying secularism doesn't correlate with democracy. I'm just saying that Christianity is going to also produce democratic societies, but it has additional benefits, like I mentioned in my opening statement. And I'll remind people that when it comes to the data, there is no reason to worry about societies with mostly Christian, as Phil had mentioned. We don't see these negative benefits. I mean, you've lived in the United States for many years before. Was it absolutely horrible? I don't think so. And most people here are Christian. I used to live in, for example, like Southern Illinois, which was highly Christian. It was great. There wasn't like these high levels of corruption, crime, violence running around. Everyone was pretty chill. Are there areas with religion that have high crime rates? Yes. And there are secular areas that also have that as well. This is why we need to do multivariate analysis, just because for every secular area or every Christian area you could say that has high crime rates, I could cite a Christian area that doesn't, like Southern Illinois when I lived there, for example. So we need to actually do the actual studies. This is why I relied on so many in my opening statement, because I want to avoid doing this bivariate means comparison. There's a horrible racist out there. Her name is Amy Wax. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's awful. She makes these similar arguments, Phil. She's like, listen, all the white places, they have much lower crime rates than the black places. What does that tell you? It tells me you're an idiot, Amy Wax, because you're doing a bivariate analysis. You just can't look at race and crime and draw a connection. We can't do the same thing with religion. We just can't go religious areas, non-religious areas, case closed, guys. No, we got to do an actual research, the studies to do the multivariate analysis to factor out these kinds of things. Because if a racist can use those horrible arguments to try to argue white skin is better, that should tell us that these arguments are not that good and we're suffering from association fallacies or even an ecological fallacy. When it comes to the actual data, though, it shows Christianity, it just produces more optimal societies. So people actively working to try to lower religiosity, specifically Christian religiosity, are not doing society a good thing. It's like cutting a rose off at the stem. It may look good for 1 or 2 generations, but in the long run, it's not going to be good. And I refer people to the research I cited. Let's see what happens when 4 or 5 generations later, it's all secular, or if it even makes it that long, what's going to happen. I highly encourage people to check out the research. Check out videos on my channel, like how Christianity changed the world. Does Christianity cause Christian nationalism? I have another video called Does Christianity Cause War and Violence?, where I go over a lot of research there. And another video is Christianity Harmful? You can check out that video as well. And I'll be doing more videos in 2025, like how Christianity ended slavery, how Christianity created science, how Christianity spread literacy and education. So there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of Christianity, and it's going to produce more optimal societies that can actually produce sustainable birth rates that can last for generations. In the end, this is why Christianity is far better than secularism.
Thank you, Michael. Phil, you have 5 minutes for your closing remarks.
Yeah. If you want to know what it's like to live in a highly Christian society when you're gay, check out Pray the Gay Away, and you'll see how wonderful it is to be gay in a highly Christian part of the United States. I'm glad you had a great time in South Illinois as a white, I assume, a white straight man, but trust me, if you were anything beyond that, it wouldn't maybe have been so jolly. You probably would have been kicked out of your church, kicked out of your home, and treated miserably like homosexuals have been in all religious, highly religious societies. Unless I'm wrong, I guess Christianity's always been supporting gay rights, and Islam supports gay rights, and that's not my reading of history. If you're gay, Christianity has been a big foe. That doesn't mean there aren't gay people who are Christian and find good things in Christianity. You bet. I would say most Christians are wonderful people because they find the good in Christianity and ignore the bad. And that's how it ought to be with any system, secularism included. Take the good from it, ignore the bad. So my closing argument is I think Michael has a very narrow view of what Christian means. It's his version. It may not be yours. And this is the problem when you have religion dominating society. No one can agree on the truths, the big truths, the capital T truths. They base their claims on things that have no evidence. You have to have faith in them. They don't even make any sense, like, someone says like, well, God is also Jesus at the same time and there's a Holy Spirit. That doesn't mean anything. It's just poetry. It's just metaphor. What's a Holy Spirit? I don't even know what you're talking about. And there's no evidence for it. In fact, there's no evidence for the main claim, the things that Michael says have to make you a Christian, there's no evidence for. So he's saying you have to believe some ancient superstition with no evidence in order to have an optimal society. And I'm saying you can believe those things if you want, but you don't have to. You don't have to. You can not know the deep mysteries and still work to fight injustice. You don't have to know what created the universe. We may never know. It may be beyond our understanding. Let's put those things aside. We've got bigger problems than deciding, who created the world and what's going to happen after we die. Let's figure out how to solve problems in the here and now. And I promise you that all the prayers in the world, they're not going to solve these things. They don't solve childhood leukemia. What solves childhood leukemia is the scientific method. As Christopher Hitchens said, Jesus cured a man of blindness, why didn't he just end blindness for all of us? The reason is because it's an old story. It's an old legend, just like all old stories about fanciful miracle workers that go from village to village doing things like that. Humanity can draw from those stories, just like we draw from Greek myths, just like we draw from Aesop's fables. They contain a lot of wisdom and goodness, but they're no basis for establishing a democratic, free, modern, rational society that is diverse. That is diverse. And Christianity is true. You're going to find people persecuted if they don't believe in that version of Christianity. You're going to find all the people that, gays and lesbians are not, the only reason gays and lesbians are accepted in Christian societies right now is because of secular values, not Christian values. And you can read, Colin Brown's work on the great things that secularism has done in the UK, from abortion rights to contraception to sex ed to women's rights to gay rights. We're all against the opposition of the Christians, not because of them. I've traveled the world, and I can tell you right now, the best places on earth that I have been to are places where people have freely let go of the Christian dogma at the heart of the Nicene Creed and have simply learned how to live democratically, tolerantly, accepting diversity and freely, without trashing religion, without abandoning religion, without outlawing religion. No, no, no. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which is what Michael's advocating, the establishment of Christianity, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which is what I'm advocating as well. I don't think anybody should be prohibited from practicing their religion. It just should not dominate those who are not of that faith. And to me, if Michael's correct, I kind of welcome it. I'm happy to know that Christianity, creates tolerance and science and all these great things. That's awesome. Didn't Christianity grow out of Judaism? So couldn't we say it's actually Judaism that provided all this? And didn't Judaism grow out of some pre-existing Zoroastrian Middle Eastern faith? So where does it all stop? Where does it all end? Where does it all begin? And I feel like Michael's really good at saying, oh, I don't know who Amy Wax is. I've never heard of her. Sorry, sounds like an awful person. And I agree with you that we can't just, you pick one difference and say that's what produces it all. But I kind of hear that's what you're doing. You're saying Christianity did all these things, Christianity, and it doesn't seem like you're being very nuanced by saying, I'm trying to say that Christianity is part of the story, but not. You seem to be saying that Christianity is the source of everything, from the scientific revolution. Yeah, thanks for listening.
All right, thank you. That is it for this debate. And I want to thank both of you for participating, and I hope that everyone at home watching has enjoyed it. Make sure to check out Michael's channel, Inspiring Philosophy, as well as Phil's work by visiting his website, and the links will be found in the video description.